There's a very specific, very quiet moment that happens inside a narcissist, one that has nothing to do with love, nothing to do with missing you in the way you might imagine, nothing to do with the kind of grief that makes someone genuinely reckon with what they've lost. It's a moment of pure, disorienting math failing to add up. Because for a narcissist, relationships operate according to a formula they've relied on their entire adult life, tested and confirmed across every previous connection. Apply enough pressure, wait long enough, perform enough remorse, and the equation eventually balances back in their favor. The person comes back. The supply resumes. The story continues exactly where it left off, as though the rupture never fully mattered in the first place. When you stay gone, not for a week, not for the dramatic month that usually precedes your predictable return, but genuinely, permanently, completely gone, something inside that formula breaks in a way nothing in his psychological toolkit was ever built to repair. And today we're going to walk through exactly what happens inside a narcissist when the math simply stops working, when the variable he always counted on, your eventual return, is permanently removed from the equation. Let's start with understanding why staying gone specifically, rather than simply leaving, produces such a distinct psychological experience for a narcissist, because this distinction matters enormously to everything that follows. Leaving, in a narcissist's mental framework, is something he's witnessed before, something his entire relational history has taught him to interpret as temporary, survivable, ultimately reversible through the application of familiar tactics. He's seen you threaten to leave. He's seen you actually leave, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, only to eventually return once his charm offensive, his manufactured vulnerability, or simply the exhausting weight of missing him became too much to sustain. This history creates a deeply entrenched expectation, one that operates almost independent of conscious thought. Departures end. Return is simply a matter of time and correct technique. Staying gone violates this expectation so completely that it doesn't just disappoint him. It creates something closer to genuine cognitive dissonance, a fundamental mismatch between what his entire relational history has taught him to expect and what's actually, undeniably happening. And this mismatch, this failure of his most basic predictive model for how relationships work, produces effects that extend far beyond simple sadness or loss. Here's what actually starts happening inside a narcissist during the early period of your sustained absence. Once it becomes clear this departure isn't following the familiar script he's always relied on before. The first psychological shift involves something we might call predictive collapse. Throughout his entire life, a narcissist has operated according to a relatively stable internal model of how people respond to him, how much they'll tolerate, how effectively certain tactics work, how reliably his charm, his charisma, his carefully cultivated persona can secure the outcomes he wants. This model isn't simply a strategy he consciously employs. It's become, over years of consistent reinforcement, something closer to his actual understanding of how reality functions, how relationships work, how he fits into the world around him. When you stay gone, genuinely and permanently, this model doesn't just fail to produce the expected result. It fails so completely, so undeniably, that it threatens the entire predictive framework he's built his understanding of relationships around. This isn't simply about losing you specifically. It's about losing confidence in a system he's relied on his entire adult life, a system that has always, eventually, produced the outcome he wanted through some combination of the tactics we've discussed throughout previous conversations. This predictive collapse creates a specific kind of anxiety that goes beyond ordinary sadness or loss, because it's not just grief over a single relationship ending. It's a genuine crisis of competency, a threatening question his psychology has almost no tools to process. If my usual approach doesn't work this time, what does that mean about my ability to secure what I need in every future relationship as well? This question, even when it remains largely unconscious, drives much of what happens next, because it explains why the escalation of tactics during your sustained absence often intensifies far beyond what the situation would seem to warrant from an outside perspective. If this were simply about missing one specific person, the intensity of his response should theoretically decrease over time, following whatever natural grief trajectory applies to genuine loss. Instead, you often witness the opposite pattern: increasing intensity, increasing creativity in his attempts to reestablish contact, increasing desperation that seems disproportionate to what a healthy grief response would typically produce. This disproportionate intensity makes complete sense once you understand what's actually at stake for him. He's not simply trying to win back one person. He's trying to restore a fundamental sense of competency and predictability that your continued absence is actively, progressively dismantling. Every day that passes without your return doesn't just represent one more day without you specifically. It represents accumulating evidence that his most reliable psychological tool, the system he's used to secure supply and validation throughout his entire adult life, has genuinely, permanently failed. The second major shift that happens during sustained absence involves something even more psychologically significant: the gradual erosion of what we might call narrative control. Throughout the relationship, and even throughout the initial period after your departure, a narcissist typically maintains a specific, self-serving story about what happened, why it happened, and what it means about both of you. This story usually positions him as more sympathetic than the actual events would support, recasting your legitimate departure as unreasonable, sudden, or somehow evidence of your own instability rather than a rational response to his behavior. This narrative typically remains sustainable as long as it exists primarily within his own internal world, reinforced occasionally by people in his life who either don't know the full story or who he's successfully convinced of his version of events. But sustained, genuine absence on your part creates a specific problem for this narrative maintenance. It removes the ongoing evidence his story depends on for continued plausibility, even to himself. If his internal narrative suggests you left unreasonably, without sufficient cause, driven primarily by your own issues rather than his behavior, this narrative implicitly predicts that you'll eventually recognize your error and return once you've calmed down, once you've had time to see things more clearly, once whatever temporary emotional disturbance drove your departure resolves itself naturally. Your continued, genuine absence directly contradicts this prediction, week after week, month after month, creating a growing, increasingly undeniable gap between the story he's telling himself and the reality he's actually experiencing. This growing gap between narrative and reality doesn't resolve quietly or comfortably. It creates something psychologically significant that manifests differently depending on how deeply entrenched a specific narcissist's defensive patterns actually are. But the underlying mechanism remains remarkably consistent across most cases. The narrative has to be actively, continuously revised in order to remain sustainable, and each revision requires increasingly elaborate psychological work to maintain. In the earliest stages of your sustained absence, revision typically looks like extending the timeline of your expected return. If she hasn't come back after a week, the story shifts to she needs a month. If a month passes without contact, the story shifts again to she needs more time to process, but she'll eventually see reason. This kind of extension can continue for a surprisingly long period because it requires relatively little psychological restructuring. The core narrative that you'll eventually return once sufficient time has passed remains intact. Only the specific timeline needs adjustment. But eventually, as months turn into what might become a year or longer, simple timeline extension becomes increasingly difficult to sustain credibly, even to himself. This is where the second phase of narrative revision typically begins, and it's considerably more psychologically costly than simple timeline adjustment. This phase often involves actively revising the story of the relationship itself, sometimes quite dramatically, in ways designed to make your permanent absence feel less threatening to his overall self-concept. This might look like gradually shifting from she'll come back once she processes this towards something closer to I'm actually better off without someone who was clearly unstable or unreasonable. This shift serves a crucial psychological function because it reframes your continued absence from a personal failure, evidence that his usual approach genuinely didn't work this time, into something closer to a fortunate outcome. Evidence that he successfully avoided continued entanglement with someone fundamentally unworthy of his investment in the first place. This narrative revision explains a pattern that often confuses and hurts people who eventually hear, through mutual connections, how a narcissistic ex has begun characterizing them, and the relationship long after genuine sustained absence has made reconciliation clearly, permanently impossible. The increasingly negative characterization isn't simply cruelty for its own sake, though it certainly produces cruel effects when it reaches you. It's active psychological defense, a necessary revision required to protect a self-concept that cannot survive genuine acknowledgement of having lost someone permanently through his own behavior, without some kind of protective reframing that shifts the meaning of that loss into something more tolerable to integrate. There's a third significant shift that occurs during genuinely sustained absence, one that operates somewhat independently of the narrative revision we just discussed, though it interacts with it in complex ways. This involves what we might call supply diversification, and understanding this pattern is crucial for anyone wondering whether a narcissist's continued absence of contact means he's genuinely moved on completely, or whether something more complicated is actually happening beneath the apparent silence. Because here's something important to understand about how narcissistic psychology typically responds to a genuinely unavailable source of supply. It rarely produces sustained isolation or genuine solitary reflection, precisely because the underlying emptiness that requires external validation doesn't simply disappear because one particular source has become unavailable. Instead, this emptiness typically drives increasingly urgent efforts to secure alternative sources, sometimes multiple alternative sources simultaneously, specifically because the psychological system underneath narcissistic behavior cannot tolerate the genuine void your permanent absence has created. This explains why so many people report the specific painful experience of learning that a narcissistic ex moved into a new relationship with startling speed, following what should have been, by any reasonable timeline, a period requiring genuine grief and reflection. This rapid replacement isn't evidence that the previous relationship, or your absence specifically, didn't matter. It's often evidence of exactly the opposite. A psychological system in genuine crisis, desperately seeking whatever alternative source of supply can most quickly fill the void your sustained absence has created, precisely because that void has become genuinely, uncomfortably undeniable. This diversification, though, rarely produces the same intensity of investment the original relationship with you once received, at least not initially. And understanding why reveals something important about what your sustained absence actually accomplished, even though it might not initially seem like much of a victory from your perspective. New sources of supply, particularly those secured quickly during a period of genuine psychological crisis rather than through the more careful, patient idealization process that typically characterizes narcissistic relationship formation, often function more as temporary stabilization than genuine replacement. This means the underlying crisis your absence created doesn't actually resolve simply because a new source of supply has been secured. It gets managed temporarily, while the deeper psychological reckoning we discussed earlier continues operating somewhere beneath the surface, regardless of whatever new relationship dynamics are simultaneously unfolding. This is precisely why so many narcissistic relationships that follow immediately after a significant, permanent loss like yours often prove notably unstable, characterized by rapid escalation followed by equally rapid disillusionment, precisely because they're being asked to accomplish something they're not actually equipped to accomplish, resolving a genuine psychological crisis that requires far more than simple supply replacement in order to actually heal. There's a fourth and perhaps most psychologically significant shift that occurs during sustained, genuine absence, one that ties together everything we've discussed so far into its ultimate implication. This involves a gradual, often unconscious erosion of what we might call operational confidence, his fundamental sense that he understands how to successfully navigate relationships, secure what he needs from other people, and maintain control over how his own story gets told and understood by everyone around him. This erosion doesn't happen quickly, and it doesn't happen in a way that produces immediate, visible transformation. But over the extended period that genuine, sustained absence requires in order to fully register as permanent rather than simply prolonged, something in his fundamental orientation toward relationships often does shift, even if that shift never translates into anything resembling genuine accountability or meaningful change in how he treats future partners. This is where we need to examine, honestly and without false promises, what this accumulated psychological disruption actually means, both for him and, more importantly, for you and your own understanding of what your decision to stay gone actually accomplished, regardless of whatever specific internal process continues unfolding on his side of a separation that has finally, genuinely become permanent. Because here's what needs to be understood clearly about everything we've walked through today. None of these internal shifts, the predictive collapse, the narrative revision, the supply diversification, the eroding operational confidence, should be mistaken for genuine transformation in the way you might hope. This distinction matters enormously because it's easy, after understanding how much psychological disruption your sustained absence genuinely creates, to start hoping that disruption eventually produces something resembling real growth, real accountability, real capacity for the relationship he was never actually able to offer you. Sometimes it does, in some limited, partial way. More often, what actually happens is something closer to psychological adaptation rather than genuine change. A narcissist eventually developing new strategies, new narratives, new methods of securing supply that account for the specific failure your permanent absence represented without ever addressing the underlying structural issues that made him incapable of sustaining a healthy relationship with you in the first place. This is worth understanding honestly, because it prevents you from waiting, even unconsciously, for evidence of transformation that may simply never arrive in any form that would actually validate the hope such waiting requires. But here's what matters far more than whatever internal process continues unfolding on his side of this permanent separation. And it's the truth this entire conversation has actually been building toward from the very beginning. Your sustained absence was never actually about producing a specific outcome inside him. It was never a strategy designed to teach him a lesson, force him into growth, or punish him appropriately for how he treated you throughout the relationship. Understanding what happens inside a narcissist when you stay gone is fascinating, even validating in certain ways, but it was never actually the point of staying gone in the first place. The actual point, the thing that matters infinitely more than his predictive collapse or his narrative revision or his eventual supply diversification, is what your sustained absence made possible for you specifically. Because while he's been experiencing everything we've discussed today, the disorientation, the psychological crisis, the increasingly elaborate mental gymnastics required to protect a fragile sense of self from genuinely confronting permanent loss, you've been doing something entirely different, something infinitely more valuable than anything happening inside his psychology. You've been building an actual life, not a life organized around waiting for his eventual realization, not a life measured by whether his narrative revision eventually softens into something resembling genuine accountability, but a life built on your own terms, according to your own values, filled with your own sources of meaning that never required his validation, his understanding, or his eventual acknowledgement of what he lost in order to feel complete. This is where the real power of staying gone actually lives, and it has nothing to do with whatever satisfaction might come from understanding his internal disruption in clinical detail. The power lives in what your absence returns to you specifically: the time, the energy, the emotional bandwidth that used to be consumed entirely by managing his moods, anticipating his needs, absorbing consequences that were never yours to carry in the first place. All of that energy, once liberated from its previous obligation, becomes available for something far more valuable than tracking his psychological reckoning from a careful, protected distance. It becomes available for you. This is worth stating directly because it's easy, especially after walking through everything we've discussed today, to feel a certain satisfaction in understanding exactly how much disruption your absence genuinely creates. That satisfaction is understandable, even earned, given everything you likely experienced throughout the relationship itself. But satisfaction in his disruption should never become the foundation your own continued healing rests upon, because that foundation still keeps you oriented around him, still measures your own peace according to metrics that exist entirely within his psychological experience rather than your own. Real freedom, the kind that actually matters, the kind your sustained absence genuinely makes possible, requires releasing even this satisfaction eventually, allowing your attention to fully, completely redirect toward building something that has absolutely nothing to do with him anymore. Not his predictive collapse, not his narrative revision, not his eventual uncertain reckoning with what permanent loss actually means for someone whose entire psychological structure was built to avoid confronting exactly this kind of reality. So while everything we've discussed today about what happens inside a narcissist when you stay gone is genuinely true, genuinely worth understanding, especially for anyone who spent years confused by tactics that finally make sense once you understand the psychology driving them, the most important truth remains this: what happens inside you during that same sustained absence matters infinitely more than whatever internal crisis continues unfolding on his side of a separation you finally, permanently chose to maintain. You get to become someone whose sense of worth no longer requires his validation. You get to build relationships with people actually capable of the reciprocity you always deserved. You get to discover who you are when you're not managing someone else's psychological stability, absorbing someone else's consequences, organizing your own emotional life around predicting and preventing someone else's inevitable disappointment. This is what actually happens when you stay gone, the part that matters most, the part no amount of understanding his internal disruption could ever fully capture. You stop being defined by what you left behind. You start becoming who you were always meant to be, all along, not because he finally understood what he lost, but because you finally, completely understood what you deserved.